All right, last class we talked about the PBR guide, part 1. Today we are going to dive into the second part of the PBR guide, the practical guidelines for creating PBR textures. For this instance, a lot of it's going to be referring to substance, but they are the general methods that you're going to use to author your textures, whether it's in Substance, Photoshop, Marmoset. Quixel has their own suite now. Even in ZBrush, right? The principles, the underlying principles are going to remain the same. The only thing that might change is you might, depending on the engine you're going into, you're going to either be working with, roughness maps or specular gloss maps. So those are going to be the only two big differences when it comes to your final output, and keeping that in mind. All right. So last class we talked about dielectrics, conductors, how to treat them, some of the equations that go into it without diving too deep into some of the math behind the texturing processes. We talked about gamma and how it affects, your linear space versus gamma correction, and how it affects your artwork and different things like that. And we also definitely went into how light and its properties affect what we see, color, reflection, and how to handle all of those things. So today we're going to go further into that process. This is the part 2 of the PBR guide. You can find this lecture on the YouTube channel as well, because I'm recording it for you guys. So don't feel like you have to memorize everything. You can always go back and refer to these lectures. All right, so let us dive right in. All right, the PBR guide. So in part 1, we defined PBR from a technical and theoretical standpoint. In part 2, we will discuss the practical application of authoring PBR textures and provide a set guidelines that are based on the foundations established in part 1. We'll begin by redefining PBR from an artistic perspective. From there, we will address the principles of the metal/roughness workflow. We will then follow up with the specular gloss workflow, which is what I kind of talked about in the introduction. The differences in the authoring methods, it is best to read through both workflows to get a full idea of the overall guidelines for authoring PBR textures. In this guide, we will discuss workflows using the Substance toolset, but the principles discussed from map creation apply to any software used to create physically based textures and materials, which is what I just kind of went over in the introduction. Physically based rendering, PBR, is a methodology rather than a hard standard. There are specific principles and guidelines. There's but no one true rule, which means there can be different implementations. The map types and workflows used can vary. A GGX BRDF is commonly used, but there can be variations in the terms. Also, some implementations can change the map names, even though their underlying usage remains the same. All right. And right now, when I first kind of started getting to know PBR, it was kind of hard to understand what maps are interchangeable for what and what they mean. Sometimes you'll get, thickness maps. Sometimes it's called an opacity map, right? They change depending on the software. Their naming might be different, right? It's funny because ZBrush has in the community is known for just coming up with names and people having to okay, what do you mean by this? It's the same thing as this, but they're just naming it something different, right? ZBrush, in every software to move right and left is one way. ZBrush will be like, nah, we doing it this way. So softwares, different software makers, different, people, they definitely name things different, But usually what you'll find is the underlying use of them is usually the same thing. So if you understand the principles, right, which is what I want you guys to kind of grasp out of these conversations, if you guys understand these principles, you can then take those principles and then use them anywhere else. All right, you can use those principles for any application. All right, give me one moment here. One moment. Yeah. All right. So when we talk about the practical guidelines for creating PBR textures, in this part, we will discuss the two most common workflows, which are metal roughness and specular glossiness. The Substance toolset for authoring PBR maps, which is comprised of Substance Designer, Substance Painter, and Substance Bitmap to Material, supports both workflows. As of today, I don't think Substance B2M even exists anymore. Substance Designer still exists and Substance Painter still exists, but I think they've converted Substance B2M into like Modeler or something like that. I don't use that package, but I do use Substance Designer and Substance Painter. All right, the Substance PBR shaders for metal roughness and specular gloss use the GGX BRDF shader and do not use any value remapping for roughness/glossiness. However, if any custom remapping is needed, this can easily be implemented in a program like Substance. All right, there's also Quixel Designer. Like I said, there's also Marmoset as well. All right. All right. So furthermore, custom shaders are supported in the Substance toolset, which means you can adapt Substance to any customized pipeline. While both workflows have pros and cons in their implementations, one is not superior to the other. It is the underlying concept and guidelines that will make the PBR maps you author accurate, rather than the workflow itself, right? The idea of, hey, am I going to be treating this as a metal or a dielectric, right? When it comes to metal, the color is coming from, remember, the roughness map, right? Rather than the diffuse map or the albedo, right? These are the things that will help you guys understand, okay, this is how I should treat it. All right, so if you just look at this chart, just to give you guys an idea, right? These three maps usually stay the same. There's a height map, right, which controls, essentially, you think about it as 0 is down, 1 is up, so up and down, right? That's the height map. It can, and different programs like Unreal and Unity handle height maps differently. All right, there's the normal map, which is when you bake your high poly onto your low poly sculpt or texture or model or whatever it is, and then you gather the information from the high poly and then you put it on the low poly. All right. Then there's the ambient occlusion, which is essentially the shadows and the brighter parts, right? This helps emphasize the darker, the shadowy parts of the model to emphasize the cavities and things like that. Sometimes it's called a cavity map, right? Depending on what you're using, right? So the main differences that you're going to get is, instead of in the metal roughness workflow, right, they have a base, roughness, and metallic. However, in the specular gloss workflow, you've got a diffuse, sometimes called the albedo. The albedo is recent for me. I've literally, since I've started working and doing this, I've always heard diffuse. Substance introduced albedo. Like I ain't never heard albedo until I started using Substance. So that's another one of those, like, they just be making up words sometimes, Then glossiness, right? And then the specular map, right? So, and if you look at how they're authored, right, the roughness, right, this is showing you, okay, what is, depending on if it's metal or not, right? The metallic is going to help you say, hey, look, if I'm looking here, what part of this is metal and what part of it is not, right? This is going to determine how shiny and not shiny it is. This is going to determine if it's metal or not, right? In gloss, the gloss map, right, kind of does a mix of both. And then the specular does what this does. All right? So it's going to be confusing at first, but the more you do it, the more, depending on what software you're going in as your final, right, you'll choose the one that works better. I think both Unreal and Unity use both methods, but I have noticed that metal roughness looks better in Unreal than it does in Unity, but specular gloss looks better in Unity. That might have changed, but last time I was working in both softwares simultaneously, I would be like, oh, the metal roughness workflow works a little better inside of Unreal, and specular gloss works, it just looks better inside of Unity. That might have changed, as time, and their softwares have definitely updated to maybe close the gap a little more. The workflow represents the same data, but they implement it in different ways. So what is PBR? PBR is physically based rendering, sometimes called PBS, or physically based shading. It's a method of shading and rendering that provides a more accurate representation of how light interacts with surfaces. It's referred to as physically based rendering or physically based shading, depending on what aspect of the pipeline is being discussed. Physically based shading is usually specific to shading concepts, and PBR is specific to rendering and lighting. However, both terms describe the process of representing assets from a physically accurate standpoint, right? And what you'll notice is people do use them interchangeably, right? Even though, you'll notice that sometimes people go, oh yeah, I use PBS or I use PBR, They're saying the same thing. What they're saying is, we're trying to represent this model as accurate as possible based on real world physics, right? How light interacts with it, what happens, and things like that. All right. So the benefits of this is that as artists, we can view the benefits of PBR from an artistic and production efficiency mindset. PBR removes the guesswork of authoring surface attributes such as specularity. Since its methodology and algorithms are based on physically accurate formulas, it is therefore easier to create realistic looking assets. This is interesting for me because prior to the PBR, the physically based rendering system, you pretty much had to paint every single one of these layers and create every single one of these layers yourself, and then tell the computer, all right, this one is the specularity. And then there was even a time when you would paint color in your specular to give your specular some color. So if you had a blue, tinted metal or something like that, you would paint blue in your specular map, right? To get that to show up in your model, right? And I remember this when I was in school, these are the things that I had to do. But now a lot of that is handled in either the roughness map or the metallic map, right? Because the metallic map will say, okay, this part is metal or not. And you can then implement some color into that, right? Using tint to tint that color, right? So you're getting that from just one map, when as you would need the specular, the diffuse, the AO, the this, all of those. When now the formulas, it just looks realistic by doing, just following those energy conservation rules and just saying, all right, this is metal, this is not. The computer's going to do the rest, right? And it's just like a black and white grayscale map now, rather than you having to determine it yourself, all right? So assets will look accurate in all lighting conditions, right? The reason is because back in the day, we didn't have dynamic lighting. In video games, the lighting was baked in. What that means is you would build a level, right? You would build your entire level in Unreal, whatever it is, right? And at the end of the day, when the art director has said, "Hey, this is done. We've approved this. This level is good to ship." What we would then do at the end of the day is we would bake all of the lighting in. We'd set up our lights. We'd say, "All right, boom, boom. This looks good here. This looks good there. This looks good. All of these places." Then we would hit bake. That process could take, it's usually, you do it at the end of the day, because if you're baking lights and stuff, that's an overnight process. And what that does is it makes you have something called static lighting. What that means is if you go into a room, right, and I do something like I move my character around, the lighting isn't changing how my character looks based on how he's moving, where he's walking. The shadows aren't dynamic or anything. They're all baked in. The lights aren't going to move. The lights aren't going to change. They're not going to react to you doing anything in the environment, right? But what PBR does is it says, all right, if you don't even want to, you don't have to bake your lighting in anymore, right? Some people still do, depending on the project. Like if it's like a mobile application, you're probably still baking your lights in, right? Like if we're being honest, like I don't know any mobile projects. Maybe Fortnite, like on iPhone, may have dynamic lighting, but I doubt it. Like you probably still have to bake those lights in. And baking lights is something that was just a part of that. That was just how we did things. That's how we worked. Is at the end of the day, everybody gets all their assets. You make sure all your assets are checked out of SVN or whatever. Is everybody ready to go? Boom, bake. You start baking. We heading out for the day. All right. You come back the next morning. All right. Does everything look right? Oh man, this guy forgot to turn this off, and this guy forgot to do this. Now we gotta rebake. 3 hours. All right, let's take lunch. But PBR has kind of changed a lot of that, right? Unreal Engine now has dynamic lighting, lumens, right? These things that you walk around and the lighting's following you, the shadows follow you. You can get cascading waterfall. If I walk through the waterfall, the light will sparkle through, and it's all dynamic because it's behaving like it's the real world. And that's where we want to get to. We want to get to the place where everything looks like you can throw it in the sunny desert of the Sahara and it'll match that environment. You want to take it in. I want to take it to the Amazon rainforest where it's green and lush and it'll fit right in, and the lighting will be perfect. The reflections will be right. The shading, everything, the shadows will look correct to whatever environment. I want to be able to take it to the Arctic, right, where everything's blue and crisp and white. Right? And now my model looks like it belongs there. That is the idea of PBR, right? Your assets will look accurate in all lighting conditions. So PBR provides a workflow for creating consistent artwork even between different artists, right? Because what you could get is, all right, even with your characters, right, you would have to bake in certain lighting. Like you'd bake in the shadows, you'd bake in a lot of these things into your character. Now you're not baking those into it anymore. You're letting the computer, you're letting the Unreal Engine, you're letting Unity, right? You're letting those engines do the work for you, do the heavy lifting of lighting and shading it. And you, as the author of the textures, you're making sure that what's supposed to be metal is metal. What's supposed to not be metal is not metal. And the colors is right in the right place. You're using the diffuse when you're supposed to. You're using your roughness maps to add a little bit of surface variation, right? Things like that that really do affect the model and make it look more realistic. All right. So as artists, we need to think differently about the maps that describe the attributes of a surface, as advances in computer hardware and rendering allow us to more closely simulate the physics of light. We need to throw out the concepts of diffuse and specular maps from traditional rendering workflows, because these maps only serve as workarounds for approximating light interaction with material. Like I said, back in the day, you're painting the lighting on the, like, if I had this shirt, I'm painting how the light is gonna be on it. I'm like, okay, I'm imagining that my environment, the light is coming from above, so I'm gonna paint the light streaks on the jacket. I'm gonna paint the, we're not doing that anymore. We author them as kind of like base textures, right? All right, I'm going to make sure that the weave is correct, that the patterning is correct on my shirt. I'm going to make sure maybe the lettering is correct on my shirt. Maybe the embossing or the embroidery is correct on my shirt. But I'm no longer adding the lighting information to my diffuse map, and I'm no longer adding color information to my specular map, right? I'm letting the computer and those things determine, all right, if the lighting is over here, well, then light should be pouring onto my shoulder, then it should be, coming directly over here. If the lighting is this way, it should be affecting my face, my glasses this way, right? I'm letting the computer do that now because, well, our computers have gotten faster, better, stronger, right? They're the Iron Man that we never had in the past, all right? So we need to throw out those concepts. All right, in PBR, the shader handles the heavy lifting of the rules of physics through energy conservation and the BRDF, while as artists, we create maps that are guided by physical principles, right? So I want to make sure the stitching is the right size. I want to make sure that the cloth weave is the right size and things like that. Those are the things that I care about as artists now, right? It allows you to be more of an artist in the sense that you're creating and authoring these things for more realistic, real world effects, right? Like the real world is going to affect it, and that's how you should start creating your textures. So the scientific aspects of PBR take the guesswork out of material values and allow us to spend more time on the creative aspects of texturing. I feel like I just said that twice. While it's important to adhere to guidelines and author maps correctly, this doesn't mean that we must now disregard our artistic intuition. It is the artistic perspective that truly brings character to a material, revealing its story through carefully crafted detail and expression. And it's weird because what that kind of means is, like, when you're making clothes, well, you kind of have to think like a seamstress, right? Like when you're making armor, like you have to think like an engineer, right? Like you have to start almost like assuming these roles now as an artist. And that's one of the things that when PBR and all of this workflow, some people loved it and some people were against it, right? There were people that I know that were very against the PBR workflow and how it's going to just change how we do art. And, there's just this is what I realized is new technology scares people a lot because a lot of people are used to doing things a certain way. And when there's something there to kind of upheave and change that dynamic, it feels weird for people, and people feel very, very like, wait, you're changing I used Photoshop for 10 years, and some people are going to feel attacked by this. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about other people, all right? Oh, this is how we used to do it back in the day, and like, bro, this is going to make your life easier. It's going to make your life better. It's going to make the things you're doing just that much, it lets you get back to being an artist, right? But then you have to, like, when you're making clothes, you have to think like a seamstress or, a garment maker, when I teach you guys drapery and things like that, right? You have to know, like, there's people who are dedicated to just making clothing, and there's like a program for Marvelous Designer, right? And the way you make the clothes is you're using like cut patterns from actual clothing, right? This is where we're getting to, right? So it's important, like the physics of the process should never be the artist's main concern. Just because we are working in more physically accurate environment does not mean that we cannot create stylized art. For example, Disney's physically based reflectance model was designed to be a principled approach, right? The GGX BRDF is based on Disney's principle of how, that works. That is, it was geared more towards art direction rather than strictly physical model. It is important to know the principles and the guidelines without being slaves to them. As artists, we need to think differently about the maps that describe the attributes of the surface. There are new map types with rules and guidelines to follow. And that's what this lecture is hopefully here to teach you guys. All right. So the metal roughness workflow, which is defined through a set of channels which are fed to a sampler in the PBR shader as textures, right? I think Blender has their own PBR shaders. 3ds Max, I know, has its own PBR shaders. Unreal, pretty much everybody has gotten around to creating their own PBR. So all you need to do is author the maps, export them, bring them into whatever software you're using, and then plug those bad boys in. All right. The maps specific to the metal roughness workflow are base color, metallic, and roughness. We will discuss each of these map types, which are common to both workflows. The PBR shader will also use ambient occlusion, normal, and possibly a height for parallax or displacement mapping, right? They say that parallax or displacement because different softwares, like I've said before, they name things different, right? Sometimes I know for a fact that Substance Designer calls it both displacement and parallax, right? There's a displacement parameter and there's a parallax parameter in there. I want to say Unreal calls it displacement, but all of it you're feeding height information into. That 0 to 1 value, 0 goes down, 1 is up. That's as simple as I can explain it to you when it comes to height maps, right? Ambient occlusion is just taking essentially the shadows, right, and the light from an object and saying, all right, this is where the shadow's going to be, this is where the light's going to be, right? So it gives you more of a shaded look or more of a shadowy look to your model, emphasizing the crevices and the cavities of whatever model you're working on. All right. So in the metal roughness workflow, the reflectance value for metals is placed in the base color map along with the reflected color for dielectrics. All right. The reflection at grazing angles is handled by the BRDF. A metallic map is used, which works like a mask to delineate, to differentiate metal and dielectric data found in the base color map. The dielectric FO values are not authored by hand as the shader handles them. When the shader sees black in the metal, it treats the corresponding in the base color map as a dielectric and uses a 4% or 0.04 reflectance value. All right. What that's saying is that when I'm in my metal map and I say this is black, or I paint a black texture in my metal map, what it's telling the computer is this is a dielectric. This is not a metal, right? So that could be this is dust, this is rust, This is grease, grime, right? It's just not a metal. That's all and the closer I get to white, the more I'm saying this is metal. This is supposed to be super shiny. So when you're saying black, okay, this might be rust, but gray, a little in the middle, but white, hot white, that's super shiny metal. That's super metal, right? That's how you should think about it when you're authoring your metallic map, right? As we discussed in part 1, the 4% value covers most common dielectric materials. It's important to note that all values such as dielectric FO, metal reflectance, and brightness ranges for albedo color are derived from actual measured data. As we look at each map type, we will talk about guidelines, which are based on measured data. In part 1, we discussed the notion of energy conservation, where the light reflected off the surface will never be more intense than it was before it hit the surface, right? We talked about how some of that light either gets reflected or absorbed, right? And when it gets absorbed, remember what happens to it? It can get transferred into heat, right? Think about light bouncing off your head, right? Some of it's going to be warm, right? Your head's going to be warm wherever the light's hitting it, but some of that light does bounce back out, reflects back out into the atmosphere, into the air, all right? So in terms of implementation, the shader typically handles the control of energy conservation. This is the case with substance. With metal roughness workflow, it is not possible to break the law of energy conservation. The diffuse reflected color and specular balance are controlled through the metallic mask. And so it is impossible to create a situation where the diffuse and specular can combine to reflect more light than it's initially received. My caveat to that is that there are other models and other shaders that can do this, right? If you do need to do something like this, you can do like the standard shader and Max can do stuff like that. The Lambert shader can do that if you use Maya. Like these are older models that they didn't really, energy conservation was not even a thought for those guys. They probably were like, we would love to do this, but it was just not part of the calculus when these shaders were created, all right? So the reflectance value for metals are placed in the base color map along with the reflected color for the dielectric. Remember, the reflectance values for metals are placed in the base color map along with the reflected color for dielectrics. So the FO for common dielectric materials is typically set at 0.4 like we discussed, which is linear, which is about 4% relative to the real world. What that means. In metal roughness workflow, this value is hard-coded into the shader, right? So it's like this is what the shader is going to automatically default to whenever you paint in your metal black. It's going to go, all right, he's trying to say this is a value of 0.04. It's not a metal. That's what we're going with. Some metal roughness implementations, such as those found in the Substance Toolset and Unreal Engine 4, have a specular control, which allows the artist to change the constant FO value for dielectrics. In Substance, this output is labeled as specular level and is supplied by a texture sampler in the metal roughness PBR shader. It represents the range of 0 to 0.08, as shown in this figure. The range is ramped in the shader to 0 to 1, where 0.5 represents 4% reflectivity. All right? So this is the range for most dielectric, right? And remember, when we say dielectric, we're meaning things that are not good at conducting electricity, right? Skin. It doesn't mean electricity won't go through your ass now. It just means you're not a good conductor of it. Metals are way better conductors of electricity. Hence, we have copper wiring, different types of metal wiring, and things like that, right? Common dielectrics, this is your range, right? Anything above, you're starting to get into metal range. And then you go anything above that, we've got gemstones, metalloids, and things like that. All right? So this is a view from Substance Designer. This is a view from Substance Painter. So if you need to manually set the FO for a dielectric, you can do so using the specular level output in Substance Graph within Substance Designer, right? And I haven't shown you guys I haven't taught you guys Substance Designer yet. It's a fun software. If you like working with nodes or anything like that, you would really enjoy Substance Designer. This is how you would go and make, essentially, like, author the base of the textures. And that was like my job for a while, which is just like, I was just a texture creation guy. Like, if they needed any sort of specific texture that didn't exist in the world, well, I would create it in Substance Designer because that's what it's specifically made for. You have all these noises and shaders and you know, different things that you can use to mix and match and kind of create. You know, I would even go and take my own and sample my own materials to create more tileable textures and different things like that. So fun. I wish I got a chance to teach you guys. I don't think I'm gonna get a chance, just because this class is coming to an end soon, and ZBrush is the main. All right. So you can do so using the specular level output in Substance Graph within Substance Designer, or the specular level channel, right, inside of Substance Painter. That's where you can find that. We'll discuss FO for dielectrics in depth in the specular glossness workflow, as you have full control over FO in the specular workflow. So dielectric FO. Base color contains reflected, diffuse color, and reflectance values for metals. So in here, we're going to add in the color and the values of the metal. And as you guys can see, right, it's reflected diffuse color for the dielectric. So you can see that when I put my color in this diffuse, it's going to translate into our final model. When I put the raw metal reflectance value in here, it's going to translate into our final model. So the base color, RGB or RGB to sRGB. The base color map is an RGB map that can contain two types of data. Diffuse reflected color. Remember, when the light hits an object, right, it's going to hit it with every single color available. And the reflected color back, right, think of that apple that I showed, right? When it's an apple, the red wavelength is so strong that that's what gets reflected back to us. Why? And that's why we perceive a red apple as red, right? Light hits it, bounces back, and it's red, right? Because it's hit it with every wavelength, and the one that returns back to our eye, right, is the red because it's the most prominent. And reflectance values for metals. The color that represents dielectrics represents reflected wavelengths as discussed in part 1. I just talked about that. The reflectance values are present if an area is denoted as metal in the metallic map. Remember, if it's black, I'm saying it's not metallic. And if it goes to white, right, then I'm saying this is metal, super metal. The base color can be thought of as being somewhat flat in tonality. Back in the day, right, I like to do, I feel like an old head because I keep saying, back in the day, I'm not that old, right? I'm not that old. But, back when, you were doing this, you would paint a lot of information into your diffuse map. Like, you would put almost everything into your diffuse map, like specular, this is metal, this is, you were doing all of that. If it's metal, you're gonna paint the metal onto your diffuse. You're gonna do it, and then you'll maybe use your specular to make it shiny, right? Not anymore. Not anymore. So the contrast is lower than that of the traditional diffuse map. Back in the day, our diffuse used to be it used to be like a contest to see how bright we can get those diffuse maps. How much color can you put in there? It is inadvisable to have values that are too bright or too dark. Objects tend to be much lighter in tone than we remember them as being. We can visualize this range in terms of the darkest substance being coal and the brightest being fresh white snow. Coal is dark, but it is not zero dark. It is not zero black. The color values we choose need to stay within a brightness range. One thing one of my professors told me is, whenever you're painting anything, right, and you pick out your color picker, you want to avoid slamming that color picker to any corner, right? 100% white, 100% black, 100% red, 100% green. There's nothing, literally nothing on this planet that is 100% of that color. Unless it's like scientifically engineered. We had to like scientifically engineer the blackest substance on Earth, right? Like science had to create it. It doesn't naturally occur. Because what you're going to realize is when you're mixing pigments together, right? You're going to throw a little bit of white in. You're going to throw a little bit of black in. You're going to throw a little bit of blue in, right? And light is going to affect it. So there's all of these properties that make even the red that you're seeing, it's not 100% red. It might be light red or dark red or, so color is so... It's so much more robust than I don't want to say feeble eyes or feeble interpretation of them are, right? So it's important for us to remember that colors are not 100% anytime. So I always try to urge you guys, when you think something is like red, dial it back a little bit. It's not red. It's probably a little dark red or a little light red or, maroon. There's subtleties to it. And what with that is I want you guys to think more subtly about color, right? And as regards to the brightness range, we're mostly referring to dielectric reflected color. So in the figure, right, that you see here, you can see an example where the dirt value has fallen below the correct brightness range. For dark values, you should not go under 30 to 50 sRGBs. The range for dark values could be more tolerant at 30 sRGB and stricter at 50 sRGBs. For bright colors, you should not have any values that are higher than 240. That's what I'm talking about. Slamming it all the way to the right or slamming it all. It just doesn't, that's not how color works, right? So the correct method right, is most of our coloring is going to kind of look a little flatter, a little less vibrant than you would think, because this would be way too dark and it isn't an accurate representation of, because what you're gonna remember, what you've got to keep into account is light is still gonna have to affect it, right? If you put it in an environment, if you put it in anywhere, light is going to have to come into the equation at some point in time, and the light itself will brighten up some of these colors or put some of it more in shadow. So if you already have it looking like a shadow, you're just going to create a black hole. So you want these things to be much, much more subtle. And that's something that I had to get out of the habit of, because I was trained in the old ways, in the old method. Right, I was trained in the in the ways of you gotta make everything popping. Everything's gotta be, it gotta look like it's on a showroom floor before you get it. No, not anymore. Right, this is the new method that we're all trying to adapt to, and you guys may have heard of it, may have not have heard of it, but these are the new paradigms that we're having to kind of work with, because hardware has gotten better, software has gotten better. We can take way more polygons. We can take way more pixel depth, way more pixel density in our screens. Our monitors get better. Everything is in 4K now, even though everything we watch is in 1080p, right? 4K, there's 12K, there's 32K, there's, I don't know how many Ks there's going to be, but it's getting ridiculous. So we're trying to adjust to how good all of these things are getting over time. So we stated that the base color contains data for reflected light in terms of dielectric materials, and thus it should be devoid of lighting information such as ambient occlusion. That's another thing we used to paint into our diffuse maps, right? I would bake on my diffuse, I'd slap that bad boy right on my base color, my diffuse texture back in the day, right? You would just overlay it. So now my diffuse includes lighting for information, ambient occlusion information, micro occlusion, like it would, we used to try to jam pack everything into diffuse maps. And what we had to learn is this is not the way, right? All of these can be separate, and then it allows you for more flexibility, more control of your individual model, and it allows the computer, right, to do the heavy lifting of going, all right, this can be darker. This is, if I'm lighting it from this angle, it'll affect, if I rotate it, the lighting is changing accurately to it. All right. So there can be exceptions for adding micro occlusion in cases where the shader would not be able to represent this level of detail with only an ambient occlusion channel. However, if micro occlusion is added to the map, it still needs to be governed by the brightness ranges. The values in the map that indicate the reflectance values for metals should be obtained from real-world values. These values are going to be around 70 to 100% specular, which we can map to an sRGB range of 180 to about 255. In the Substance PBR Utility section, we will discuss tools that provide preset FO values for common materials. The metal roughness charts provided by Sebastian Legrade are also great result. He posted these in like 2014. I think I should have a copy of it somewhere that I can send out. So values that indicate the reflectance values for metals should be obtained from real-world measured values. Color represents albedo for non-metal materials and reflectance values for metals. Base color should be devoid of lighting information with the exception of micro-occlusion, and even those should be governed by the lighting principles that we've discussed. Dark values should not be lower than 30 sRGB to 50 sRGB. Bright values should not be higher than 240 sRGB. Remember, you're not slamming that mixer, you're not slamming that color picker, that color wheel, you're not slamming it all the way to the right, to the left, to the bottom, to the top. There's a range in between for a reason. That's where a lot of things in our world fall, right? Reflectance for raw metal is going to be high, in the range of 70 to 100% specular, which we can map to about 180 to 255 sRGB. The metallic map operates in a manner similar to a mask, as it tells the shader how to interpret data found in the base color. And as you read in the metallic section below, the base color also can contain metal reflectance value. If dirt or oxidation is added to the base color, this will cause the metal reflectance value to diminish to a range that cannot be considered as a raw metal. The metallic map must also account for the addition of dirt or oxidation. And when they say, oxidation is just rust, guys. Sometimes they try to change the words up. I don't know, rust. And its value must be lowered in these areas to indicate that it is no longer considered as raw metal. In the figure, you can see that the rusted metal is treated as dielectric and set to black, right? This rusted parts, all of that is treated as a dielectric, so it's set to black. The dirt layer is also accounted for in the metallic map with a transitional gray value. The metallic map may not always be binary 0 to 1, 0 being black, 1 being white. When there is a thin layer of dielectric material such as dirt, right? So it's kind of in between. Like I said, when you're doing your metallic value, you're going to get a range, right? Black being dielectric, white being bare metal or raw metal, and then gray is in between, right? You might have a dirt layer, grease layer, right? And the computer then is going to determine, all right, based on the fact that this value is this, I'm going to say this is this color, or this is this metallic, or this is not metallic, or this, So that's how that works. So metallic, grayscale, and linear. The metallic map is used to define which areas of a material denote raw metal. As a grayscale map, it operates in a manner similar to a mask, as it tells the shader how it should interpret data found in the base color. So what you got to think about is, okay, I've got my base color. Now my metallic map is going to tell the computer what it should do with these colors, this information that I've put in here, right? That's all you're thinking of this metal map. Think that's all it's doing. It's saying, all right, based on what you've given me, you're telling me that this, right? You're telling me that this rusty part is black, dielectric. You're telling me that this little gray portion right here is metal, white close to gray, gray close to white. You're telling me that this in between, this little dirt layer is in between. So that's all this map is just giving the computer a framework for how to interpret the information that you've put into your base color, sometimes known as diffuse, sometimes known as albedo, right? 3 different words meaning the same thing. All right. The data in the metallic map does not contain real-world data that is directly used as material value. It simply describes to the shader which areas in the base color should be interpreted as reflected color, and which areas denote metal reflectance value. In the metallic map, 0, which is black, or 0 sRGB, represents non-metal, and 1, white, represents raw metal, about 255 sRGB. In terms of defining raw metal and non-metal, this metallic map is often binary, black or white, or which is metal or non-metal. In practice, when the shader looks at the metal map and sees white, it then checks the corresponding area in the base color map to get the reflectance value for the metal as shown in this figure. All right. So, creation guidelines. Metal surfaces have two important aspects relating to texturing. First, their reflectance value will be higher in the range of 70 to 100%. Specular. Second, some metals can be corroded. We will look at these two aspects individually as we discuss the creation guidelines. Metal areas that fall in the range will need to have a reflectance value of 70 to 100% reflective. All right. So these are the colors. Boom, boom, boom. And when you put those colors in there, they all do have their own reflectance value, reflectance property, right? Polished silver, polished gold, all of them have their own different reflectance value, right? sRGB wise, right, this is their value, but how they reflect is different. Some metals are duller than other metals. The metal is to be authored as 0 to 1, metal or not, and is used to define a raw, polished metal state as a general guide. The grayscale value for raw metal will be defined as 235 to about 255 sRGB in the metal map. Metal areas that fall in this range will need to have a reflectance range of about 70 to 100% reflective in the base color map, which we can map to about 180 to 255 sRGB shown in the figure to your right. Again, these values are based on real world measured data, right? Scientists, the funny thing is, man, I'm going to do it again. Back in my day, we used to go on, there's this website, and you would go and look up the index of refractivity for every single thing you're working on, right? If you're working on some metal, if you're working on a hard surface model and you're doing a lot of metal, you'd have to go in and type in, all right, this is aluminum, right? Silver, what's the index of refractivity? You'd put that in, into your shader, and it will then reflect it because all of these have real world value, right? These are measured values. Nowadays, the computer does all that for you. You guys are lucky. You guys are really, really lucky that the computer pretty much calculates all of these kind of values for you. You didn't have to go hunting them down to make sure that you had I used to have them memorized, is how much I used to look these up. I don't remember them anymore because I've been spoiled by, the substances of the world, So corroded or dielectric layer. When you weather a surface, you may need to consider that the metal is oxidized, or to compensate for other environmental aspects such as dirt, grime, and dust. In these cases, the metal needs to be treated as dielectric. The same is true for painted metal. Think about the paint as more dielectric. If you look at a painted metal where portions of the paint have been scratched and chipped away, the metal exposed is raw metal, right? That's going to be hot white. right? Hot white. That's going to be that raw metal. Think about like a painted armor on something, right? And the paint is a dielectric layer. Black is the metallic map, right? So that's the black, which is the chipped, this is the paint, and then where it's chipped away is where we're going to treat it as raw metal, right? We're going to treat the paint as dielectric, and this is how the computer will treat it. And the interesting is, this might change over time. Like this might eventually change again to a more complex method. But that's gonna, that's once again gonna just probably make it a little more, I don't want to say difficult to author your materials, but it might give you a couple more steps in between authoring your materials. I've thought about some different ways where there's some things that you would separate in the material process that would make it a little better, but I digress. So the metallic map can represent a blended state between metal and non-metal that is represented by transitional gray values in the map. If the metallic map has gray values lower than 235 sRGB, you need to lower the raw metal reflectance value in the base color. Think of a dirt layer that is partially obscure portions of raw metal as shown here. The dirt is dielectric. So if you were to leave the metallic map at full white, it would treat the dirt as dirt areas in the base color as the reflectance value for metal. It would make the dirt metal. The dirt color value is much lower than the value needed to represent the 70 to about 100% reflectance for polished metals. By lowering the metallic map value in areas represented by the dirt, you can create the appropriate blend between the dielectric and the metal reflectance values. So the opacity of the dirt layer can indicate how much to lower the reflectance value in the base color. There are no hard and fast rules here. You are essentially moving from a high reflectance value, conductive, to a lower reflectance value. However, the degree to which this transition is taking place may vary. And this is where some of the artistic leanings will kind of come into place. And that's essentially what these methods are trying to give back to you, is they're trying to give you back more control of how these things are looking. So the substance tool set allows easy use of weathering effects as well as control over how these effects will propagate to the channels through multi-channel support. Substance Designer and Substance Painter allow you to change parameters on the substance effect generator, which will automatically adjust the channels that are controlled by the substance effect. Maybe next class I'll show you guys like some substance stuff that I've done, some Substance Painter, some Substance Designer, just so you guys kind of see some of these values in action. All right. For example, in Substance Designer, you can use a material color blend node to apply an effect such as a dirt across multiple channels. On the material color blend, you can control the dirt layers effect on metal by adjusting the metallic value slider. All right. So this is the slider right here that you can affect. And the cool thing about Substance Designer is I can open up all of these parameters. So like I can open up all these parameters and then send it to whoever's going to use it. If they're going to use it in Unreal, if they're going to use it in Painter, and you can have those sliders available so you can increase the amount of dirt or rust on the object. And what that will also do is it affects every single layer. It changes all of those layers automatically for you. And it just, shows as a slider, which is pretty cool. Or you can do it as a number value. So these are pretty cool features that come with this texturing package. Metal that is oxidized but needs to be treated as dielectric or rusted metal. The same is true for painted metal. Black 0 is non-metal and white 1 is metal. There can be transitional gray values to account for oxidation or dirt. If metal map has values lower than 235 sRGB, then the reflectance value needs to be lowered in the base color map. The roughness map describes, the roughness map describes the surface irregularities that causes light diffusion. Remember we talked about how most surfaces on this planet have kind of these micro facets, this micro detail, these surface irregularities, right? That affect how light diffuses and is spread throughout them. All right. The reflected direction will vary randomly based on the surface roughness. This changes light direction, but the light intensity remains constant. Rougher surfaces will have a larger and dimmer looking highlight. Smoother surface will keep specular reflections focused, which can appear to look brighter or more intense, even though the same total amount of light is reflected. All right. In this map, black, which is about 0, represents a smooth surface, and white 1 represents a rough surface. What you'll also notice is that a lot of these maps deal with 0 to 1 values, right? Height map uses 0 to 1, and they'll mean different things. For the metal map, 0 to 1 refers to the black and white, which is black is dielectric, white is raw metal. For the roughness, the roughness map is probably the most creative map, which allows the artist to kind of visually define the character of the surface. All right. So it allows you to creatively tell a story about the condition of the surface. What is its environment? How it's been handled with care or disregard? Has it been exposed to the elements? The condition of the surface tells a lot about the environment and thus relates to the overall design of the asset and worlds you're trying to create. All right. And for the height map, right, we use 0 to 1. 0 is down, 1 is up. All right. So roughness is a highly subjective area. You, the artist, are in full creative control. A good place to start with roughness is the normal map. The normal map will often contain key surface detail that should also be represented in the normal map. And I do have a lecture on normal maps that we will have to go through. So let's talk about resolution and texel density. So a byproduct of using the following metal roughness workflow is that it can produce a white edge effect. They've gotten better with this over the years. Edge artifact, as shown here. So if you look right here, you can see this kind of artifact right here. The blending that's because the blending isn't perfect. So it also occurs in specular glossiness workflow. In that case, however, it is not nearly as visible because the effect is reversed. There is a black fringe instead of a white one, as shown in the figure. All right, so this is the spec gloss. This is metallic roughness. All right, and that's because the transition isn't going from 0 to 0 to 0.9 to 0.8 to 0.7 to 0.6 to 0.5. It's going from usually 0 to 1 or 0.5 to 1. So those transitions will create that artifacting effect. This fringe is due to texture interpolation and is apparent in the transitional areas between materials, where there's a sharp contrast between a dielectric material and a very bright metal. This is shown in the figure right here. With metal roughness, the base color contains a brighter value for the metal reflectance that is interpolated with the non-metal diffuse color, which produces the white edge. With specular gloss, the diffuse map contains black since the raw metal has no diffuse color. The black value is interpolated with the non-metal diffuse color, which in turn produces a black fringe. The document resolution and textile density have a direct impact on the visibility of these edge artifacts. For example, if you use a hard edge brush to create the transitional areas between metal and non-metal, a low document resolution will still soften the edge and thus exacerbate the artifact. This low resolution issue is also caused by UVs that are not scaled to provide adequate textile density based on the document resolution. Providing a good textile density for UVs is the best method for minimizing any edge artifacts. All right. What that means is the size of your document. Are you using 1024? Are you using 2048, 4096? Right? Are you using 8K maps, 10K? Right? And are you sizing your UVs to be appropriate to that? The more textile density, the more pixel information that you can pack in these, the better those transitions are going to be. Right? That's as simple as I can understand, So this is good textile density, this is bad textile density. Whoever did this didn't appropriate right for their material. All right. So it's 1:22 now. That's going to be it for the day. All right. So with this information, next class, what we're going to do is we're going to go through skin and how to paint skin inside of ZBrush, taking into account some of these conversations that we've been having about these texture processes and PBR and how the PBR workflow affects ZBrush. All right.